YouTube, hello! Yes, back again after another period of intensive work, which has been a lot of fun. A lot of fun? 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 What's that about? Ah, God, I've lost my powers of articulation. It's too early in the morning for YouTube, that's why. It's too early in the morning for me to be socializing in any capacity and trying to express myself that isn't in scribbling. Usually I would be scribbling right now, but I've got a lot of editing work to do for Dark Moon Digest and Dark Moon Books. Go and check them out. I will leave links down there in the crotch cricket bar. Yes, lovely, lovely horror stuff from Dark Moon Digest. Some of my stories too. They're actually publishing one of my stories, in a best of Dark Moon Digest, which will be coming out a little bit later this year, I think. Or yes, a little bit later this year. So keep an eye out for that. The best of Dark Moon Digest. My stories in that. Yes, but yeah, editing at the moment. Lots of fun. But I have been working on a project, a joint project actually, with someone here on YouTube who you may know, Nick Hardy, who is part of the Transformers collecting community, also a very, very lovely chap, who does really interesting work. Generally, he runs a photography company that's rather cool. I'll leave links to that down there too. He's a superb photographer. Anyone who's seen my profile picture on Facebook will know he is a stunning photographer. It's the best photograph of me I've ever seen. I mean, I generally don't like photographs of myself at all. I just there's something about I don't know. It just does not seem to work for me. I always seem to be gurning or pulling a ridiculous face or distracted by something, staring off at a squirrel or a butterfly or something like that. But this photograph that Nick took whilst I was at a dinner party at Ray I Love Mess's house is just superb. It's absolutely beautiful. So go and check Nick out. I'll leave links to his YouTube channel down there with the other stuff that I'm linking to in this video. What am I talking about today? Well, I really want to talk because I've been watching a lot. I've been going over of late a lot of the horror cinema that I really enjoy. The stuff that I watched when I was a child, and when I say child, I mean a child. I mean like when I was 5, 6, pre 10 years old. I was watching horror films very early. I've always liked horror. The stuff like the Evil Dead, Alien, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original Stanley Kubrick Shining, the John Carpenter's The Thing, Night of the Living Dead, Don't Look Now, the horror that defined what horror is in mainstream cinema. These are the movies that people look to when one thinks of what horror cinema is. They are the icons, the archetypes of mainstream horror cinema, of which there are many derivations and derivatives, of which there are many offshoots and attempts to recreate, and very rarely successfully. It's the horror. There is a very particular period in mainstream horror cinema, particularly for American horror, which is golden. It's the age when horror cinema was in its ascendancy, and that is from the late 1960s right up until the early 80s. What is it about the horror cinema of this period that makes it so good, that makes it so iconic, that makes it more than just plastic, fantastic, hideously telegraphed jump scares? Well, I'd argue that it's simply because mainstream cinema, mainstream studios were much braver at that period. They were much more willing to take risks and to fund independent projects, and projects that were going to genuinely upset and disturb and unsettle, rather than feeding into preconceptions of what horror cinema is. They were much braver back then. Also, there were things happening within culture, within politics, within world events that were informing the cinema that people made, and this included horror cinema. Horror cinema, at its best, is not simply a matter of making people go, ah. It's a matter of unsettling people's preconceptions. It disturbs and upsets them. It makes them think, it makes them realize that the parameters by which they define their existence, the little safety nets, the walls they build around themselves, are neither absolute nor are they impermeable. In fact, they are crumbling and will always be in a state of decay, no matter how much you try to maintain them. That's the point of good horror. Good horror in any medium is about transgression. It's about transgression and transcendence. It's about realizing that all the preconceptions by which one defines oneself, by which one defines the world, by which one defines culture and humanity and society, and so on and so forth, reality itself even, in some extreme cases, are flimsy, that they are protean, that they can be broken down. That's the whole point of horror cinema. It may make you feel uncomfortable. It may even make you feel negative. It may give you a reaction that's entirely negative. It may make you feel soiled or upset or despairing or whatever. But that's the point. That's the whole purpose. Bad horror cinema is what we currently have being spewed out by mainstream sort of Hollywood studios, which is basically hideous by the numbers remakes of classic pieces of horror cinema, which are entirely designed by committee. They are directed by idiots who have absolutely no concept of what of the beats and the rhythms of horror cinema, of how you genuinely evoke a sense of dread and anticipation and tension in the audience. And people who have no idea of how to use horror, of how to use the emotions of horror, disgust, of despair and disturbance to make a wider point, to convey a story. That's the problem we are currently having with mainstream horror cinema. And it's been in a state of fermentation for quite a long time at the moment. But good horror cinema, the mainstream stuff that actually changed the way people regard not only horror cinema but cinema itself, actually acts as a reflection and exploration of what's happening in wider culture. Of course, during the late 1960s, right through the 70s up until the early 80s, you have this state in America in particular, not just in America, throughout the Western world, but particularly in the USA, where the traditional ideologies that define what it is to be American, to be a member of USA society, are breaking down. You have things like, you have political scandals, you have economic crises, you have civil rights issues, protests, you have these incredible eruptions of counterculture. You have people fighting back against the oppressions of government, of standardized structure, and against the impositions of culture, of what it is to be American, what you should aspire to, how you should define yourself as an American citizen. You also have things like Watergate, you have the Vietnam War, and all of the cultural issues that resulted in the gradual decay of America's dreams of itself, the very plastic, fantastic lies, the fantasies that America has of itself. And this is reflected very much in the horror cinema of the period. You have movies like David Lynch's Blue Velvet, not necessarily a horror piece in and of itself, but certainly a work that is unbelievably disturbing and unpleasant, which is about looking beyond the white picket fence. It's about looking beyond, it's about peeking through the curtains after the lights have gone off and seeing what's really happening behind closed doors. The people who dress well, who don't take drugs, who go to church every Sunday, and who are nice to their neighbours. It's seeing what happens behind those closed doors. It's looking in the fridge and finding the severed corpse of a child. It's digging in the back garden to clean the septic tank and finding a mass grave. It's that. It's exactly that. That's what horror cinema of this period is always about. It's about unsettling and unseating cultural preconception. In that regard, it has some substance, it has some weight, and also it has more behind it than just this desire to make the audience throw up their popcorn. That's certainly part of it. There are jump scares in movies such as The Thing, in movies such as The Fly, in movies such as The Shining, certainly. But first of all, they are technically better. Their timing, their execution is better than 90% of those you will get from any mainstream horror movie you care to name of the last 15 years, I would say. Secondly, the jump scares aren't the only thing. These movies do not attempt simply to scare you. They are attempting to unsettle you. They are attempting to put you in a condition of mind where everything, all your certainties have been shaken, and that's what's so wonderful about them. You have The Evil Dead from the early 1980s, which most would not regard as a terribly intellectual movie, but if you actually look at it and look at what was happening in the 1980s, around the period it was produced, you have things like the punk movement, which The Evil Dead is. The Evil Dead is a punk horror movie. It's the horror movie that spits in your face. It's the horror movie that has piercings and jagged, multicolored haircuts. That's exactly what it is. It's the horror movie that swears and curses and which doesn't give a shit whether you say nice things about it or not. It is a punk movie, and in that regard it has some cultural relevance, and it has even more cultural relevance when you realise what happened around it. It is one of those movies that was part of the video nasty scare, when you had incredible conservative movements within politics and within culture attempting to rein in all of the erosion of the countercultural movements that had occurred throughout the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s. It was an attempt by culture and society, by the powers and authorities whose privilege and power relies upon sustaining these structures, to rein everything in, to bring everything back by fomenting an entirely synthetic terror of video-born violence and horror and so on and so forth. It was a way of establishing a tribal enemy by which the more conservative parts and powers within society could cohere and redefine themselves. Thus, you had, certainly in the UK, you had this massive movement towards censorship with the likes of Mary Whitehouse and her movement, these very particular, largely religious or moral minorities imposing their standards of taste on all and sundry. Of course, the upshot of that later now is that that these movies that were banned have sustained iconic status. People want to see them because they want to know what the fuss is about, and The Evil Dead was one of these movies. And it seems utterly ridiculous seeing the movie now that anyone got so worked up about it, because yeah, it's unbelievably graphic and gory, and the characters suffer immeasurably, but it's unbelievably comic book as well. It's so gory, it's so ridiculous, it's so over the top that it becomes a matter of self-parody. It's actually ridiculous to watch. It is quite atmospheric and quite scary. Certainly in the opening segment, there's an enormous, like with all good horror movies, there is an enormous amount of tension, of build-up. The movie takes a lot of time to establish character, to establish mood, setting, all of this stuff, back mythology, and it just cranks up the tension very, very slowly, in the same manner as The Shining does, and then allows things to explode and devolve later on. So you get this wonderful rhythm, you get this very masterfully constructed sense of story where you are drawn in as the audience. You're drawn in, you actually engage with the situation and the characters rather than just having it thrown in your face right away. Another thing that horror movies from this particular period did is that they established characters that you cared about, whether they were likable or not. Where they generally tended to be quite ambiguous. You know, there were characters who had things to like about them and things to dislike. The characters from Alien are a really good example. The characters from Alien are just people. the way they're written and the way they're acted is they are just people doing a job. They are literally truckers from outer space, and it almost feels like the camera has been dropped into their workplace, and you're just seeing people going about their jobs with all of the crudity, the unpleasantness, the camaraderie that naturally occurs within that kind of situation. There is something about postmodern horror movies that are occurring now in mainstream cinema, where every character is patently unlikable. And the reason they're unlikable is because they're badly written. They tend to be hideous stereotypes that act in ways that you can project and telegraph, and you can tell exactly what's going to happen to them because the writing is so inept, because the direction is so inept. That's something that earlier horror movies, particularly horror movies from the period that I'm talking about, didn't suffer from. Again, I endeavour to point out that I'm not railing against all modern horror simply because it's modern. No. There is some really good horror out there. It's just that you need to go to extreme places to find it. You need to go to foreign markets. You need to go to non-English speaking markets. You need to go to independent arenas in order to find the good horror. The good horror is it's like the stuff that's being produced here on YouTube. It's the Slender Man stuff. It's the Marble Hornets, the Everyman Hybrid, the Tribe 12, that sort of thing. It's day vault horror. That kind of thing. The independent horror that is not constrained by the need to make money. That's where the good horror is coming from. That's certainly the horror that is most profoundly and most acutely reflecting what's happening in wider culture. That has more substance to it, that has more depth than the hideous Eli Roth, who I fucking hate, by the way. And I mean, I fucking hate the man. I hate his movies with a fiery passion. Hostel, the Gorno Hostel style stuff. Hostel is one of the worst horror movies I have ever seen. Ever. The reason being there's nothing to it. It's just bodily mutilation. And yes, you can use bodily mutilation and graphic scenes of pain and evisceration and whatnot. You can use it to, in a wider sense, you can use it to evoke a particular state of emotion in the audience, and then use that to make your movie better, to make it more profound, in the same way that the original Hellraiser does, and movies very much like it. Suspiria does something very similar. The movies of Dario Argento do it all the time, as do the movies of Cronenberg and John Carpenter's The Thing. Body horror is a really good example of how you can use graphic images of bodily decay, mutilation, of pain, of gore, and so on, to provoke a specific response which ties into the wider themes of the piece. Body horror, for example, is all about, it reflects decay, it reflects disease, it reflects evolution to a certain extent as well, metamorphosis. There are profound themes within body horror. There's even beauty. I mean, if you look at the monsters in the Thing, in John Carpenter's The Thing, for example, the monsters are beautiful. They are these Lovecraftian, shapeless, amorphous creatures that blossom with all manner of alien organs and with little bits of familiarity thrown in, little bits of human, little bits of dog. They are absolutely stunningly beautiful. Grotesque, seeping, lymphy, practical effects, wonderful, wonderful creatures. Very solid, very real and organic looking, but brilliant. Utterly, utterly wonderful. Cronenberg's remake of The Fly with Jeff Goldblum is another really good example. The decay of Seth Brundle as the Fly is an absolutely wondrous, grotesque, engaging metamorphosis, and it's unbelievably horrible. Graphic to the nth degree, to the point where bits of him fall off, bits of his anatomy fall off. And it's about that man's metamorphosis from a state of humanity to something else. It's utterly, utterly wonderful. But movies like Hostel have nothing to them. All they're designed to do is provoke a very puerile reaction of, oh, that's gross. And that's it. There's nothing else to them. There's nothing underneath. There's nothing profound. There's nothing even remotely interesting to them. They're one-trick ponies. They are ultimately one-trick ponies. All you can do with movies like Hostel, the Gorno movies, is mutilate. And once you've seen the extent of bodily mutilation, they've got nothing else. There's nothing else to do. They are ridiculous, absurd, and utterly meaningless and shallow pieces of tripe. And that's all Eli Roth does, to be perfectly honest. It's all any director of Gorno does. The other thing that we have is endless sequels. We have franchise bait, basically. We have studios that deliberately set out to create horror movies which pander to the lowest common denominators. People who don't generally enjoy horror as such. People who don't understand what horror is. People who don't go to watch a movie to be genuinely unsettled, to be genuinely disturbed. Who don't really want to feel that. They want to go, have the moment or the moment, and then get up and walk out again. And that's it. For me, if a horror movie allows you to walk away from it without feeling deeply unsettled in yourself, then it's failed. It's a failure. It doesn't matter how much you enjoyed it whilst you were in the cinema. It's an utter failure. And that's what we're getting. Saw is a really good example of that. I mean, I know people love the original Saw, but I don't get it. I don't get why people react to it the way they do. It's not a bad movie. I endeavour to say that. I really do. It's not a bad film. It's very competent. But it's only competent. There is nothing new in it. There's nothing that brilliant about it. There's nothing terribly surprising. And it's one of those movies that has been utterly murdered by its sequels. The sequels are utterly ridiculous. Every single one of them. I mean, if there was ever a movie that didn't warrant a sequel, it's one where the main character is dying and is going to die very soon after the movie occurs, if you like. It's utterly ridiculous, and the way the writers and directors strain to synthetically stretch that franchise is fucking ridiculous. It really is. I mean, they stretch the levels of credibility and credulity to the nth degree. Saw in space. I mean, we will see that. I guarantee you we will see that at one point. It's so fucking ridiculous, and it's the kind of movie like the Final Destination movies, which is just a one-trick pony. All it is an excuse to have a series of increasingly elaborate deaths. That's it. It is just a string of elaborate deaths. There is nothing to it. There is more to horror than that. And one of the excuses people give for this is that, oh, well, you say we've had the golden age of cinema. That's when everything occurred. Everything that could be told has been done. That's why we're getting remakes and whatnot. Bullshit. Utter bullshit. I not only read horror all the time, I write horror all the time. I edit horror all the time. Go into your local Waterstones or whatever, and go and pick up one of the mammoth books of horror. The mammoth books are basically compilations of horror short stories that have been written within that particular year. They tend to be annual. There are also books of body horror, like specific horror books of body horror, of ghost horror, of haunted house horror that they collect. Go and read one of those compilations and you will find stories and images and monsters and concepts that have never been seen in cinema before. Certainly not within the constraints of horror cinema. And they are everywhere. High invention is everywhere in horror literature. It's just not there in horror cinema. Go and read Clive Barker. Go and read Weave World. Go and read Imagica. Go and read The Damnation Game. Go and read Poppy Z. Bright. Go and read some of the horrific works written by Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman's written some wonderful bits of horror short fiction, or short fiction which has horror elements. And we have never seen these things before in horror cinema. Never. There's a whole wealth of material that's not being plumbed. And the reason it's not being plumbed is because studios are more conservative now. They're much more afraid of what they can put out there, of offending moral minorities. They're much more afraid of not recouping their losses, of not making a profit on their work. And the reason for that is because audiences are more conservative now. Horror has become more commodified. Horror has become a matter of expectation. People go to a horror movie thinking they know what to expect, and the studio gives them that. It's it's a matter. It's like when you have a child who has been raised to have a very unadventurous palate, so they won't try anything new. They'll only eat bacon sandwiches, or they'll only eat, cheese Wotsits or something like that. My response to that is just grow the fuck up. Really, grow up. As audiences, as cinema goers, we need to grow the fuck up. We need to ask and demand more for our money than what we currently do. Particularly with regards to horror. There is a fandom, there is a very fervent base of horror fans who know what's good, they know what they like, but they are being ignored. We are being ignored. My tribe, if you like, my people, certainly a tribe I am more willing to be associated with, are being completely ignored. The hardcore horror fans, the people who know what good horror is, who have been raised on it, who enjoy it, who like feeling genuinely disturbed and unsettled, are being marginalised and pushed aside by mainstream cinema to pander to the wider audiences, to the sort of 12A, PG-13, 15 crowd, the ones who want horror that's just labelled horror but isn't genuinely frightening, that isn't genuinely disturbing or scary or horrific. They just want to see the Final Destination teenage brats get killed off in increasingly elaborate ways. And that's it. It's fucking ridiculous. In order to get decent horror, to get the kind of horror that unsettles me, which takes a lot, I will tell you. In terms of horror, cinema and literature, it takes a lot. It is rare. So rare that I come away from a horror movie or a piece of horror fiction and feel genuinely unsettled. The Slender Man stuff generally does it. The good stuff, the Marble Hornets, Everyman Hybrid, and Tribe 12 stuff does it. Not too long ago, the Japanese movie, which doesn't have a release over here, Norori, did it. That's a wonderful film. That is an absolute stunner. And this is where you have to go. You have to go to foreign markets. You have to go to art house markets. You need to go to underground independent horror. It's the only place where you will find decent horror. Sadly, the genuine horror, the stuff that will seep into your consciousness and will twist and turn and will hurt you. As the audience, it will spiritually wound you. That's good horror. It's the horror that makes you feel unsettled, like you want to leave the cinema, like you don't want to be watching what's happening, or you don't want to be considering the implications of what's happening. That's good horror cinema. What we're currently getting now from sort of Hollywood mainstream cinema is pick and mix horror. It's confectionery horror, which has no weight. It has no intention of actually frightening you. That's the thing. It's just arbitrarily labelled horror because it reflects a particular structure, a particular stereotype of what horror movies are. Which generally just involves teenage brats being successively killed in overly elaborate and utterly ridiculous ways. I mean, it's one of those things. Horror cinema, all cinema does it, but horror cinema in particular it moves in this very particular undulating serpentine way. It has peaks and it has troughs. We had a peak very recently, historically speaking, in that period from the late 1960s right through to the early 1980s. We're having a trough now, unfortunately. We're having a deep and abiding trough. It will pick up again. There'll be something that comes along. There will be something, a piece of work that rejuvenates the entire genre, that makes the genre laudable again, that makes it legitimate again. It's the way it happens. The Exorcist was one that did it. Arguably, the original Halloween was one that did it. The Blair Witch Project is one that did it. Night of the Living Dead is one that did it. They come along and they redefine the zeitgeist. They shift the paradigm to a point whereby independent, imaginative, and inventive horror cinema becomes legitimate again, and you get studios actually paying attention. You actually get the people with the money paying attention. They consider that, oh my god, we can give quite not much money comparatively to these independent people, have them produce something wonderful and make money back off of it. And when they realise that, that's when horror cinema picks up again. That's when we start getting the really good stuff from mainstream horror. I mean, one of the ones that I really hoped would do it was the recent project by Guillermo del Toro to film At the Mountains of Madness, the H.P. Lovecraft story. Guillermo is trying, apparently, to get this done, but it's been sort of jostled and jockeyed about. It's in development hell at the moment. Whether it will ever come about, I don't know. But that could be one that does it. Because having read The Mountains of Madness, I really don't think there's anything I can think of in horror cinema like it. Like the imagery, like the tension, the surrealism, the just sheer fucked up weirdness of that story. I would love to see that filmed and done well. And if anybody can do it, it's Guillermo del Toro. Guillermo del Toro has an eye, not only for horror cinema, but just for fantastique cinema, for the subject of the surreal and the absurd and the utterly beautiful. He is a stunning filmmaker. If anybody can do it, it is him. But that is certainly my hope at the moment. I genuinely want to see horror cinema have a resurrection, if you like.